You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
If you're chasing data down instead of seeing it in one place, you need the Intuit ERP. Intuit Enterprise Suite. All your data in one place with built-in AI for real-time insights. Learn more at intuit.com/ERP.
Your favorite local grocery stores like Kroger, Ralph's, Fred Meyer, and more are now delivering on Uber Eats. Get 40% off your order of fresh, quality ingredients. Whether you just got home to an empty fridge or suddenly got a craving to whip up something new, you can get everything you need delivered in as little as 25 minutes. Get 40% off your order with code Kroger2026. Plus, members get $0 delivery fees. Order now on Uber Eats. Orders of $30 or more save up to $25 and 4/30/26. See app for details.
This episode is brought to you by our Patreon members. Thank you so much.
Join our Patreon for extra episodes, interviews, extra content, and to help support the podcast and help us continue to do the work we do.
Go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl to learn more. I'm Jenny Williamson.
And I'm Jen McMenemy.
And this is Ancient History Fangirl. Today we are so thrilled to welcome author David Chaffetz to the podcast. He is the author of Raiders, Rulers, and Traders, The Horse and the Rise of Empires, a sweeping history of the horse and its impact on human society from the dawn of time. Welcome.
Great to be here, Jenny and Jen.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. I am so excited to do this interview because I am a horse girl. I grew up riding horses. I did 3-day eventing as a kid. I had a horse named Jack, who was the love of my life. I still love horses very much today. What's your experience with horses, and what inspired you to want to write this book?
My experience with horses started when we decided to go to Afghanistan in 1976 and to really get close to the lives of people outside the city, outside town, off-road. And the only way to do that was to ride by horseback into the mountains, into the countryside. So my friend and I bought horses and just took off out of the city. Now, I had planned to do this, and therefore I had practiced riding extensively before going, but I did not grow up with horses. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. It wasn't big horse country, but I took very quickly to a world where the horse was the most important thing in my life, and stayed so for about 6 months. That led me to realize how important traditional societies, the importance that traditional societies attach to the horse. The horse is really the most important thing in the lives of the Afghans. You see that because the national game is a game played on horseback. Maybe some of you have seen the film, The Horseman, Jack Palance, about the Afghan horsemen. And then I realized it's not just the Afghans who see the horse in such a central way, but many of the peoples of Central Asia, Northern Asia, find the horse to be really the center of their existence, the most important part of their culture. And then I began wondering, well, how does this all connect? Why are horses so important for these people? And how did that come about? And so that started about a 40-year investigation of peoples of Central Asia, Eastern Europe, Middle East, and the role that horses play in their lives.
It is so fascinating. It's such an important topic. And we have been doing a lot of Scythian horse archers in the ancient world. So we've talked a lot about the fat little ponies and like how important horses were to the warfare of the time and what a difference it made. And I was so interested to see what a deep dive you did on that topic in particular.
Yeah, well, you mentioned the fat little ponies, but one of the things I learned is that there were horses for courses, and Genghis Khan didn't ride a fat little pony. The reason why we associate the fat little ponies with the Mongols is because Mongolia is very cold in the winter and there's not a lot of food. And so it makes more sense to raise stocky, heat-conserving, long, shaggy-haired ponies that can survive brutal winters. And that's what they have. And the average horseman will not raise anything but that. But keep in mind that the Mongols also had elite cavalry because they had fairly early on become very powerful and very wealthy, and they acquired what we would consider to be sort of purebred animals, which were much bigger, much more powerful, and conform more to what we would consider to be a beautiful horse, like an Arabian horse or a Turkmen horse. And they had a lot of those horses too, because they had a lot of grass, and in the winter they would get forage and keep them in tents and so forth, so that they could survive the cold winter in Mongolia. So we shouldn't just think that the Mongols only had shaggy little ponies, and a lot of their military victories included shock troops mounted on big, beautiful horses.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the fat little ponies are also beautiful horses. They're all beautiful horses.
Yeah, I'm here for Team Fat Little Pony, but I think that's really important, right? It's the range of troops they would have had, so that you wouldn't have known what you were expecting.
I'm not an expert on ancient warfare, and I'm doing some more research on that now with a friend of mine that I have met recently who really is into this. And it turned out that these battles where the Mongols conquered much of the world at the time were fairly complex and involved many different kinds of troops, and not just as simple as surrounding the enemy with mounted archers and firing volleys of arrows into them.
Absolutely, yeah. And we haven't actually quite gotten to the Mongol Empire yet. We've done a lot of work on the Huns and, like I said before, the Scythians. So yeah, we haven't quite got to the Mongols yet, but it is a fascinating topic, and I actually really want to do a deep dive into Genghis Khan at one point, but it is a deep rabbit hole.
We start off, I think, probably in the time of the Scythians, or the earliest people. It really was just a question of fighting with arrows, because the word Scythian means archer. And so they were scary enough on the battlefield just with arrows. But you see, as time went on, the enemies caught on to the fact that they would be attacked by lots and lots of horsemen with arrows. And so they developed ways to defend themselves against this. For example, heavy chain armor for themselves and their horses. And so over time, the steppe warriors had to adapt more sophisticated tactics in order to keep up the armed race with their sedentary enemies.
Yeah, notably, Mongol warfare included siegecraft in a way that, as far as I'm aware, the Huns did not.
Correct. Because the Huns were kind of a very big protection racket, and they were content to simply harass their settled enemies and force them to pay money to get them to go away. Whereas the Mongols decided to take on major cities and rule them directly, which the Huns never tried to do. Yeah.
Jen's going to love this because she's a huge cryptid fan. Starting at the beginning, I'm so interested in the ancient past of horses. And you mentioned in your book that mythology about mythical free horses and stallions and even horse hybrid cryptids can be traced back to a time when ancient people used to corral foals to attract milking mares and couldn't capture stallions. This is in the very beginning of people attempting to domesticate horses. And this would have been, I don't know, maybe 6,000 years ago. I'm not sure. You can correct me on that. Please do. But the stallions were rarely seen and achieved an almost mythical status, making this mythology very old. And as a kid, I grew up on stories of mythical horses that were hard to capture, and those are definitely stories that kind of still reverberate. Like, there are YA books about that today that I grew up with. One horse cryptid we all know and love, of course, is the Kelpie. What's another example of a myth like this that stands out to you? Like, did they have any in Afghanistan, for example?
Well, in Muslim countries, they have basically edited out all the pre-Islamic myths that they might have inherited from earlier religions or earlier traditions. The story of the horse being partly a dragon is very common in Mongolian myth, and in Turkish myths from the Turkish peoples of the steppe. The Kazakh national epic and the Kyrgyz national epic, particularly the Epic of Manas, has warriors going into battle, and the horse says to them, "Don't worry, you're going to be all right, because actually I'm a dragon in disguise, and I can handle everything." And the horse is more, because dragons are magical, of course, and have magical powers. These horses can do many things, including carrying the wounded hero out of combat and so forth. So it's very deep in Turco-Mongol steppe lore. But whether or not I would write about milking coming before the domestication of stallions, there is more recent work which suggests that milking was later than riding, and the experts use weasel words to say, well, we have found evidence of milk in 6000 BC, like you're talking about, horse milk, mare's milk. But maybe it wasn't mare's milk. Maybe that's a mistake. And maybe mare's milk came after writing, which would make this whole story about the stallions lurking around looking for the domesticated or at least captured mares. And that may make that story, my explanation, less probable. So I think the jury is out as to whether or not we started the domestication process with captured mares and only later were able to raise captured stallions. I'm going to follow this really carefully because I think the milk story is really interesting. And the idea that we herded horses for a long time without milking them just doesn't satisfy me very much.
Yeah, there's so much we run into when we do our podcast episodes too, where whatever explanation we latch onto is one way to interpret the data, but there's many other ways. And also sometimes we release things and it turns out 2 days later, they find something different that makes it just rearranges the whole thing. So it happens.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good point, Jenny. If your theory is based on 2 teeth that were found in a site, there's so many variables that might be wrong. The age of the teeth, I mean, the carbon dating of the teeth, the condition of the teeth, the proteins that we've been able to find on the teeth. All these things can be very, very much the subject of judgment and art rather than pure science. And so you have to take all the explanations of the beginning of horses with a grain of salt, except that we are definitely heading in the right direction because our technologies for determining age and species and genetic relationships are getting very, very good.
Today, horseback riding looks more or less similar across cultures. Maybe that's a big swing, but in general, you have a saddle, a bridle, you have a bit, you have reins most of the time. But horseback riding in the ancient world looked a lot different depending on where you were. What was horseback riding like in the very earliest of times, like the very beginning of people starting to ride horses? Obviously, we know that saddles were a later invention, but before the advent of bridles, how did people control their horses? And what else do we know about how people rode that was different in ancient times?
Well, if you go back to the first people to ride horses, we can pretty much assume that you could control the horse by holding on to the mane, by using your thighs and your ankles. There is no real reason to assume that you need any tack to do any riding. Children in Mongolia will just climb up on an animal and start riding it, any kind of animal, sheep, goat, horse, small horse. The native people of America also rode horses with little or no tack originally. They just figured out a way to jump up on the horses and ride them. And that's one reason why they were such intrepid horsemen, because they didn't have all the aids that the cowboys or the gauchos had to ride the horses. So the original horse riding would have been for a very short period of time because it took a while for the horses to develop the strength to support a human rider on the back. Probably several generations of people before horses developed the strength. And they were bred with the purpose of strengthening their back. So what must have happened is when foals were born, people looked at them and said, well, this foal really looks like it's going to be a strong one. And so they would selectively breed the strongest foals, and in a period of time they wound up with a horse which could take a full-grown adult man on its back for a period of time. I hypothesize in my book that the earliest riders might have been young children or young people who were lighter and who could do herding the way young people do herding of other livestock today. So first riding was very non-intensive. Many of the gait that people think are native to horses are actually later genetic adaptations. For example, the gene for ambling appears in Viking horses and the Icelandic horse, which is a native ambler, before which most horses were not able to amble or didn't amble well enough for that to be a pace that riders would have used. So I think in the beginning, the horses did one of 2 things. They either walked or they galloped, and there was nothing in between. So if you had no saddle and no reins and no stirrups, you had to be a pretty good rider to jump up on a horse and gallop. But of course, they did.
There's like a steep learning curve, it sounds like.
Very steep learning curve. But remember, you're 7 years old, and your family had 30 horses, and they have some foals, and they have smaller, younger horses, and you just do it. And everyone around you does it, and no one walks anywhere. So I think it was the horse breeders just had a very natural inclination to exploit the speed and the fun of a horse ride from the earliest ages.
It was quite practical as well, right? Like, you're 7 years old. You can't go as far or as fast as people who were in their 20s or teens or whatever. So being able to sort of jump on a horse, you can go just as fast or as far as adults without sort of being exhausted and being able to do the same amount of work, right? It equalizes the situation a little bit.
It does. It also equalizes the situation between men and women, because I assume that in hunting societies, men had a certain advantage over women in mobility, particularly because women probably had to carry papooses, so to speak, along with them. But imagine a woman just climbing on a horse with a small child, maybe two small children. We see this in the migration of the Bakhtiari tribe in Iran, that the women put the children up on the horse as though they were sacks of grain, and they just keep up with the whole migration. So for sure, this was a great equalizer between genders as well, between ages.
It's so fascinating too, the history of gaits. I'm not sure what you mean by ambling as opposed to just walking. What is the difference between an amble and a walk?
As I understand, an amble is when the horse moves two legs on the same side forward and then two legs on the other side forward, whereas in a walk, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Oh, fascinating. I never realized there was a difference.
And ambling is very comfortable for long distance travel, and it's a very prized gait. Not all horses can do it, and it depends on a genetic modification, which seems to have appeared in the Viking horse.
I also read in your book that the trot was not initially a gait that horses had, like from earliest times of domestication. And I was so curious about the history of other gaits and what we know about that.
Well, like I said, I believe that the original horses, when we first began to ride them, only walked and galloped. Because if you think about it, that's what animals in the wild do. Either they walk or they run, right? Look at deer, look at antelope. Any number of animals which are step-dwelling have to be able to run really fast because they get attacked by predators. So there's only two speeds which you need. All the other speeds, canter, trot, amble, were all, and some of the more artistic paces, like the Venezuelan, Colombian horses have pasos finos, which are very elegant and very hard to do. All of those paces have been co-invented between horses and humans in the course of centuries, because we needed those paces for some human activity, not for horse activity.
My Arab quarter horse, Jack, when I was growing up, completely spontaneously would erupt into a very flashy extended trot that looked like a pre-St. George trot. Like, it was wild. He would just do it when he really wanted to run and I didn't want him to run.
Sure. But consider that that horse was the outcome of probably 3,000 years of selecting horses who knew how to do that trot. So it's a combination of learning the trot and also having the genetic makeup of a horse that can trot.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible.
Don't chew on that, Max.
Cooper loves that chew too.
Oh, now he's into Cooper's food. Wow, he is loving it. What do you feed Cooper?
Blue Buffalo Life Protection Formula. He never leaves a crumb. I love it because it's made with high-quality protein, nutrient-rich fruits and veggies, and wholesome whole grains.
Looks like we're switching to Blue.
Blue Buffalo foods are made with the superior ingredients your dog needs to thrive. Can your dog food say that? Visit feedbluefood.com to learn more.
AI is incredible. It can teach you how to fry an egg and even write a poem, pirate style. Yarr! But it knows nothing about your work. Slackbot is different. It doesn't just know the facts. It knows your schedule. It can turn a brainstorm into a brief. And it doesn't need to be taught. Because Slackbot isn't just another AI. It's AI that knows your work as well as you do. Visit slack.com/meet Slackbot to learn more.
Refreshing wild cherry cola meets smooth cream. the treat you deserve. Pepsi Wild Cherry and Cream. Treat yourself.
So growing up, I always thought the Przewalski horse was the only truly wild population of horses left on the planet. That was like a thing that used to be going around that I kind of picked up on as a kid. But now I learned that the Przewalski horse was actually reintroduced to the Mongolian steppe in the 90s from a population bred in zoos. And I've also seen some research that even the wild population that used to exist there was a descendant of the bowtie horses, which is one of the first groups that domesticated horses as early as 3700 BC. So is it true that there are no truly wild horses left in the world, as opposed to feral, which is, for listeners, because I didn't necessarily know this, feral would be a population that lives in the wild now and lives as wild, but is descended from domesticated populations?
It's a good distinction made between wild and feral. So a typical example of feral horse that everyone is familiar with are the American Mustangs, right? They're the descendants of horses that escaped from European settlers in Mexico and Southern America, Southern USA, which was Mexico, of course, at the time. And they ran into the wild and they flourished and they effectively became feral. Right? The research that's been going on for a decade or so, and which was summarized in a magazine article in Nature magazine in 1921, claimed, with a lot of evidence behind it, that all the wild populations of horses in the world disappeared. In the New World, they disappeared. We don't know why. In the Old World, they disappeared because the success of the new horse which you could ride, that had been bred for riding, was so evident that no horse breeding population, humans in the rest of Eurasia, had any interest in keeping these not very good horses for riding. So they were just hunted and eaten and forgotten about, whereas they took up breeding the modern domesticated horse about 4,000 years ago. And that horse was so popular to ride that within maybe 500 years, all the other populations of horses disappeared. Those populations which disappeared were some combination of wild or domesticated, but not very successfully domesticated because they weren't easy to ride. So human beings wiped them out, and the only horse that we kept was the modern horse, the modern domesticated horses. Now, you mentioned the Przewalskis. So, okay, for many years, we thought the Przewalskis were wild horses. That same research from 2021 identified that they were the descendants of the horse remains that had been found in Bowtie in Kazakhstan, which again suggests that if the horses in Kazakhstan themselves, those Bowtie horses, were domesticated, which is still controversial. And going back to what we said earlier about wait 6 months and someone will come up with another paper. It's okay. So what we believe now is that the Przewalski horses are horses which are descended from the Bowtie horses. That makes them fairly remote cousins of the modern horse, quite different genetically from the modern horse. And the fact that they went extinct in the wild and were only preserved in the zoo, I don't think disqualifies them from the characterization as a wild horse. Because a lion in the zoo is not a domesticated lion; it's just a wild animal in the zoo, right? So I think it's still fair to say that the Przewalski is the only wild horse left in the world. It's useful to remember that it's descended from the horses in Bowtie, and then we go back to the question of whether the horses in Bowtie are domestic in the sense that you and I consider horses to be domestic.
Yeah, like if those horses were also domesticated, that would mean that the Przewalski's horse still is technically feral, even though it is feral from, like, let's say 6,000 years ago, which is a long time ago. But maybe not. I mean, that's one theory among many, and I know it's quite contested.
Well, the other thing to keep in mind is there are other criteria. The Przewalski is absolutely not rideable. It's like a zebra. So maybe the Bowtie horses were kept for milking, but I really doubt that they were extensively ridden because their ancestor Przewalski has none of the characteristics that make it rideable.
Can they pull a carriage, though?
I think the answer to that is No, there were lots of experiments on Przewalski's, and no one managed to do anything with them. And the same, and again, maybe I'm confusing it or confounding my memory with that of the zebras. There have been all kinds of attempts to use the zebras as some form of equine traction or propulsion, and they've all failed.
So we just talked about the difference between wild and feral horses. I live down in North Carolina, which is not so far from some of the islands in the Outer Banks and Virginia and South Carolina, where we have what I now learn are feral horses. And I don't think they're rideable by any sense of the word. Have you ever visited these horses? And if you have, like, what can you tell us about them?
So I have read about these. I've not been to the Outer Banks to see those horses. I know exactly where it is. A friend of mine, Sarah Neer, has written extensively about those horses, and I think they're rideable. And the reason why I say that is because every year, in order to keep the population under control, every year they have an auction to sell them off. So I assume that the people who buy them eventually train them for riding.
What we're discussing is the Chincoteague ponies.
And not just Chincoteague, there's a couple of other, there's like the Asses something.
There's also Assateague, yeah. I think there's horses on both, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and they had to move them between the island to control the populations between the two islands.
So I've been out there, I've been camping on Chincoteague Island, and those little ponies are menaces. You have to protect your campsite from the Chincoteague ponies like you're protecting from bears. They will roll up in your campsite, they will tear into your food, they will absolutely rob you. So if you are going to camp in Chincoteague, you need to have like a really tight container for all of your food so the ponies don't get into it. Obviously, it's really not good for the ponies to eat that food, but try explaining it to them.
They're little raider ponies. I love them so much.
They're the best. I love them.
Feral horses are a real challenge in North America, and there's a lot of controversy because one group wants to sort of cull them and contain them, and other people want to let nature take its own course. So it's a very controversial topic in North America. There are a lot of people who think we should become vegan and we shouldn't, touch animals. But can think about it, that major livestock populations have been developed through interaction with human beings for 4,000 years in the case of horses and about 10,000 years in the case of cows, cattle, sheep, and goats. And if we don't intervene and we let them go wild again, it's not sustainable. There'll be too many of them. The environment that they came from 10,000 years ago is not the same environment as today. Of course, they'll get into campsites and cause all kinds of problems. So feral is a tough situation to be in when you've been domesticated for for thousands of years.
Yeah, the closest I've seen has been like in Greece. They have a bunch of feral dogs. Particularly, I saw them at Mycenae. And they're really cute when they're puppies. But then when they're actual big dogs, and I'm a massive dog lover, they can be quite scary, depending on the breed and the dog and how friendly they are with people. And it's like you want them to be able to enjoy the landscape and everything else, but also sometimes they're a little menacing.
And dogs, we've been domesticating dogs for like 100,000. It just shows you how important it is to maintain the link between a human and an animal that once has been domesticated.
Yeah, and how important, particularly with dogs and cats, like spaying and neuter, because there isn't enough food, there isn't enough, like they don't know where to get that from. So they're continuing to come back to humans, but there isn't always food from those humans that they can get. So it becomes really complicated.
So you mentioned the Hittites in your book, who lived in what's now Turkey in the 1300s BC, and how they hired a guy named, I may screw this up, Kekuli, as their chariot trainer and somebody to help them develop their cavalry. This is so fascinating to me. Like, you can trace this back, Hittite horse culture, all the way back to one single guy. And he wrote down instructions for the care and feeding of chariot horses among the Hattusi, which are preserved on tablets. And I remember seeing this documentary about the Dark Lords of Hattusi, where they have this like massive library of tablets. They have been translated, and we know so much about Hittite society, and that a lot of this is not very discoverable online, though. Like, I want to read it like it's in a book, and it's hard to find that. But I've heard some general things about Hittite horse culture, some of which involve force-feeding the horses, if I remember right. And you mentioned warm-up and cool-down periods, which, of course, I did in Pony Club. What else do we know about how the Hittites raised and cared for their horses?
Yeah, well, remember, they were chariot horses. So training chariot horses is very particular. you have to find two horses that like one another, and you have to figure out which is sort of the dominant, which is the follower, because in a chariot, if you have two dominant horses that try to show which one is the alpha, they're very hard to control. If you have two passive horses and one looking at the other to say, hey, why don't you go? Why don't you? So there's a lot about finding the right pair to pull you. And this is a problem which survives, down to the end of the 19th century when wealthy people had carriages with two horses. It is a major problem with horses. You have mares that don't get along for various reasons. You might want to use geldings on your carriages so they don't fight so much. But remember, these guys had stallions pulling their chariot because it was felt that the stallions were stronger. So everything involved around manipulating stallions is is super risky. And two stallions at the same time, you can imagine. So these people had horse whispering skills much greater than anything I think we can imagine today.
Do we know anything about those horse whispering skills? I mean, it seems like roping two stallions together to pull a chariot is just the worst idea.
But they felt, they're going to war. So they felt that it was important to have aggressive male animals that would bite the enemy and kick the enemy. And there may have been also a kind of a symbolic magical thought that the warriors were men, so the horses should be men. There are cultures where you consistently ride mares into battle, and there are other cultures where you consistently ride stallions. The French traveler to Iran in the 17th century, Jean Chardin, said that the Persians considered it humiliating to ride anything other than a stallion. Right? They thought that if you rode a mare or gelding, you were a wimp. Whereas, Genghis Khan's army was almost entirely geldings. So it's just a point of view. But we do know that the early empires of the Middle East used stallions.
It is so fascinating. Do you know any sources that just have all the Hittite tablets in a place where I can read that?
I'd have to get back to you. I can't imagine that they're not. I mean, the universities have transcribed onto the internet so much material. It would shock me if all those tablets are not available online. But they might be in German, because remember, the tablets themselves were taken to Germany by an archaeologist. Well, they were sold to him in the turn of the last century, and he took them to Germany. So it wouldn't surprise me if the university that possesses them has them not all online.
So you talk about the Huns a lot in your book. And by the Huns, I noticed that you equated them with the Xiongnu.
Well, I wanted to make this book an easy read, and it covers a lot of territory. And so I try to use terms which are the most easy to remember or relate to. And there's every evidence that the Huns and the Xiongnu were the same people. No one who's not Chinese could pronounce Xiongnu properly. So why use a Chinese word for people who were probably our Huns?
For anyone who didn't know, we have talked about the Huns a lot, but it was from the migration era side of things, which is mostly, Eastern, Western Europe, those areas. So for those of you listening, the Xiongnu were an ancient nomadic steppe people living on the Eurasian steppe from, I say, roughly the 3rd century to the 1st century, 3rd century BC to 1st century AD, somewhere around there. And obviously, like I said, we talked a lot about the Huns in our podcast because we have been covering the migration era. And we've talked about their horses, which certainly sound familiar when we talk about Xiongnu horse culture and their role in the Chinese acquisition of horses. So what do we know about Xiongnu horse culture, which may have also been Hunnic horse culture?
Yeah, we know a fair amount about the Huns in Mongolia on the frontiers of China because there's a very, very extensive archaeological record. It's sort of similar to the Scythians. We find wonderful sculptures and stuff. There's a book in French called Mongolie. You don't have video on this. Mongolie, the First Empire of the Steppes, with a very extensive cataloging of all the artifacts that the French archaeologists have found in Mongolia in the last 20 years or so. We know that they were big horse breeders, that was their principal activity. They drank mare's milk. They gelded their animals because if you're raising horses on the steppe, you can't afford to raise too many stallions. So they had an excess number of geldings, and they could do one of two things with those geldings. They could either sell them to the Chinese when the Chinese needed horses, or they could eat them. And then the third thing would be to use them on raids against the Chinese in order to plunder China and earn a living through warfare.
Which is definitely how we see the Huns treating the Romans as the Roman Empire decayed.
Yeah. So the thing is that the people in the steppes traded with all their sedentary neighbors because you can't live without some connection with the sedentary neighbors. There are things the sedentary neighbors have that you want. And as long as those people buy horses from you, you can trade horses for manufactured products for certain foodstuffs, and everyone's happy. If you can't trade for one reason or another, you can always attack them. Now, at some point, the Chinese were fed up with the Han raiding, the Xiongnu raiding, so they dealt them very severe military blows, which convinced them to move to greener pastures. So, as you said, at the end of the first century AD, they disappear from the Chinese radar screen. But about 100 years later, they turn up invading India and Iran, where the Iranians call them the Khuna. They settle in Afghanistan, they settle in northern Iran. Eventually, some of those units just assimilate into the Iranian or Afghan or Indian population, and they disappear from history again. A couple hundred years later, they show up in Hungary, which is a kind of unique ecosystem in Europe, which is similar to Central Asia or Mongolia. Hungary is a grassland, and it has been the base for at least three major nomadic peoples to settle, and from there to trade with the Romans or the Franks, but also to attack them when it was the right thing to do for them. So in some ways, the Huns in Europe behaved the same way as the Xiongnu behaved vis-a-vis the Han Chinese. One major difference is that by the time they reached Hungary, they were not probably as pastoral dominant as they were when they lived in Mongolia, because Hungary is quite a rich part of the world, and they would have wound up ruling many local farmers. And so their society was probably a lot more complex and more heterogeneous than it would have been in Mongolia, which is really only a place to raise livestock. And when they attacked Romans, they probably had very significant infantry, which I think was not present in the Han wars of the first century BC AD.
What do we know about how they raised their horses?
We have to assume that the environment determines the way you raise horses. So the way Mongols raise horses today is probably similar to the way the Huns raised horses 2,000 years ago. That is to say, it's a very cold climate. You have to let the horses graze outside because there's no excess agricultural resources that can be used to feed horses. So the horses forage on their own. That means they grow up to be we talked about this, rather small and shaggy. They were very pragmatic about breaking in the horses. They broke in the horses very early because they needed them for work. They couldn't just nurture the horse until it was 2 or 3 years old. And that's another reason, by the way, why they were shorter, because if you break a horse in very early, it stops growing. And I think people are very similar. If you take children and you force them to do hard labor, they don't grow to be very tall. So the Huns had a lot of horses. They put them to work very early. They lived on horse milk, horse flesh, hunting, and trading with the Chinese. Exactly the same way that the Turks did 500 years later, and exactly the same way the Mongols did about 500 years after that. So there's a tremendous continuity and persistence in the horse cultures in Mongolia, simply because there's only so many ways you can raise a horse in that environment. And I would argue that almost all horse cultures really come from the environment more than it comes from cultural factors per se.
It is so fascinating and interesting. Like just the difference between, like we said, a fat little pony, which certainly has a lot of utility in war, and how we get to a big, tall war horse, and that kind of horse being more the type of horse you would expect to see, at least in the Western world. I was around thoroughbreds and warm bloods and quarter horses and all kinds of different horses that are quite different from the little Shetland pony I started on when I was like 8, right? Like that's that's the difference.
Our horse cultures now are sort of like shopping in a supermarket. Our ancestors went to the field, and if there were potatoes, they ate potatoes. And now they can go to the supermarket and get broccoli, and they can get all kinds of different products from different, they can get grapes in the middle of the summer. They can get grapefruits all year round. So our ancestors only had the horses that grew in where they were from. And those horses were bred to be useful for the culture that they were devoted to. So in Western Europe, horses were important for traction, so we bred bigger horses. We had an extensive agricultural surplus, so we could feed horses oats, we could feed horses hay, we could nurture horses to be very, very large, like the Frisian horse in the Netherlands, for example, or the horses that draw beer carts, the Shire horse. So we could do that. The Mongols could not do that. The Turkmen lived in a desert by choice. They wanted to live in the desert because they didn't want to have neighbors. So they had to breed a horse that could survive sort of like a camel without water. The Marwari horse in India was created by the Rajputs exactly the same way. It developed in an environment where there was no water, so you had to have a horse which could race and which could persist for a long period of time without water. Now you can have a club in the U.S. that has all those horses. You can have Marwari horses, you can have Arab horses, you can have Shire horses. We're completely freed from our ancestral constraints. And that makes us less sensitive to how many constraints there were raising horses in the past.
This is Jen.
And Jenny.
From Ancient History Fangirl, and we're here to tell you about Jenny's scorching historical romantasy based on Alaric of the Visigoths, Enemy of My Dreams. Amanda Boucher, best-selling author of the Kingmaker Chronicle, says, quote, "This book has everything. High-stakes action, grit, ferocity, and blazing passion. Julia and Alaric are colliding storms against a backdrop of the brutal dangers of ancient Rome. They'll do anything to carve their peace out of this treacherous world and not just survive, but rule."
Enemy of My Dreams is available wherever books are sold.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Instagram teen accounts have automatic protections for what teens see and who can contact them, plus time management tools. And Instagram will continue adding built-in safety features to help create age-appropriate experiences. Learn more about teen accounts and Instagram's ongoing work to protect teens online at Instagram.com/teen accounts.
This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
This was actually a really interesting and very poignant part of your book. That when I was reading about the ancient Chinese empires and their attempts to raise horses themselves, because at a certain point, ancient cultures in the Bronze Age, let's say, were sort of in an arms race. Everybody needed horses, or at least believed that they needed horses in order to protect their own boundaries and do warfare, because their enemies would have horses. And so forgive me if I'm vastly oversimplifying this, but from what I read in your book, and please correct me if I'm getting any of this wrong, Chinese cultures and kingdoms or empires of the 400s to 200s BC had difficulty raising horses on their own and had to get their horses from their steppe neighbors, which they had complicated relationships with. One scholar and poet that you mentioned discussed his own missteps and how he misunderstood his own horses, and this was very heart-wrenching for me. There was this beautiful, beautiful elegy for a horse that you include in your book that I believe the 700s AD that I read aloud to myself and cried about last night. Like, I am a person who will read poetry to myself and cry. But what can we learn from first-person accounts like this, even the terracotta warriors, which you also talk about in their depictions of horses, about horses and how they fared in ancient China, and what challenges did the ancient Chinese face in raising and keeping horses that other cultures didn't?
The most important challenge that the Chinese faced was environmental, because the heartland of China, which is south of Beijing, much further south of Beijing, and so between the Yellow River and the Long River, the Yangtze River, is poor in the trace minerals that are needed to raise healthy horses. The most important trace mineral being selenium, and that part of China is really absent in selenium. So I think your reading of by the way, your reading of the story in that poem is perfect, spot on. Here, this guy gets a beautiful horse, with probably a gift from somebody serving on the frontier, and probably one of the elite horses of the Zhongnu. And he tries to raise it in central China, and he feeds it hay, and the horse gets weaker and weaker because it doesn't have selenium. And they didn't know about it. And interestingly enough, the identification of selenium as an essential mineral for horses is a 20th century discovery. A Hungarian zoologist figured it out. And until then, we just didn't know. We would have these beautiful horses, and they would get weaker and weaker, and they would have offspring which were very weak, and no one knew why. So that's the thing, that environment is really important for horses. So Chinese Empire arose in the central area, but the kind of original component state that was the most powerful state and the one that succeeded in creating the Chinese Empire was actually on the frontier with the steppe, and that Qin dynasty, which was based in a zone that still had steppe land, and so they could raise cavalry. And so, no surprise, the first emperor of China was Qin, and he had a very powerful cavalry, which is memorialized in the terracotta warriors. Actually, in the terracotta warriors, I was surprised at the number of horsemen not being that great in terms of the total. I think there may be only 20 or 30 cavalry figures unearthed, and there are hundreds of footmen. But keep in mind that a very small amount of the total army has been uncovered. The grave goes on for miles underground, and so it's possible that if someday they decided to uncover everything, they might find a much higher percentage of cavalry. I don't know.
I would suspect so. If cavalry was such an important part of their expansion, they would want to emphasize that cavalry.
Well, they needed cavalry to fight off people from the steppe, and they needed cavalry to conquer some of the other states that had cavalry on the northern frontier. But in order to conquer the core part of China, they needed infantry, because you needed to hold on to these sedentary areas. You needed to capture cities and so forth. We talked about the Mongols and their siege equipment. So the Qin army also had very powerful infantry, and every Chinese army has always had both cavalry and infantry. The Han, in particular, would march their infantry into Mongolia to try to chase after the Huns' Zhongnus with mixed success.
It is hard for me as a horse lover to read about horses and animal cruelty. And I think that is something that has held me back from doing my own deep dives into the history of the horse, which I've been tempted to do more on in the podcast. And then I'm sort of like, I'd have to read about a lot of things that would make me upset. As, animal cruelty and just, the unhappiness of the horse is a huge part of the story of horse domestication. But I want to hear some of the good things about how ancient peoples treated their horses. And you tell us about horse culture all over the world. Ancient China, India, the Mediterranean, the Mongols and Huns, many other places. Was there a concept of animal rights in the ancient world and a sense of the horse as an individual? And what are some of the ways ancient peoples protected and cared for their horses and tried to give them a happier life?
So that's a really good question. One thing we should keep in mind is that people in ancient times didn't necessarily have a concept of happiness, life being a happy event, or the goal of life is to be happy. But I think you can say for sure that they treated the horses with a great deal of respect, because they were completely dependent on their horses. I don't think they exercised gratuitous violence against their horses, because as anyone with horses knows, it doesn't really ever pay. Horses have long memories. Horses will take revenge. a consistent theme in legends and traditional literature is the deep bond between the horseman and the rider, the dependence of the horseman on the horse for survival in journeying, survival in combat, that the horse often is more intelligent than the hero and gives him advice in terms of, how to survive, how to escape enchantments, where to go when he's lost in the desert. And we know that ancient peoples venerated the horses literally, often associated the horses with the divinity or as an accessory of the divinity. And then here's the part where I think for modern people it's hard to understand. When the heroes died, their followers sacrificed the horses so that the horses could continue to accompany the hero on his journey in the other world, which is why we find all across Central Asia graves of warriors with either one horse or two horses if it's a chariot burial, or even dozens of horses if it's a great chief. And we don't particularly like the idea that they sacrificed the horses. But by the way, they also sacrificed humans. So you see that there's a different ethos here at work. But it's certainly the case that the horse was the second most important thing in the life of the human being, because you don't find other animals sacrificed in the same way. They sacrificed goats and camels and sheep as food for the defunct. And so they were placed somewhere else in the tomb, but very often the warrior, the king, the chief was buried right with his horse so that the two of them could ride off. And I think that tells you everything you need to know about the respect and love that existed between people and their horses.
At what time and where did it start to be evident that people were giving their horses names?
That's a really good question. Fairly early, because some of these tablets that you referred to, the Hittites and others, were already calling the horses names. Now, I looked at some research on this topic, and what is a little bit unclear is that the names are sometimes descriptive. And today, among the Turkish-speaking peoples of Central Asia, there's a lot of names which are descriptive. So you might call the horse Reddy, or you might call the horse Darky, or you might call the horse Gray, and that's the name. So it's not the kind of name that you give a racehorse in the Kentucky Derby, right? But in the epic poetry of the Iranians, the Indians, the horses all have really distinctive names, like personal names. And the other interesting thing is that the early Iranians and early Indians very often gave themselves their own personal names with the word horse in the name. So very similar to the Native Americans, actually. So it went both ways. They named themselves after horses, and they named horses with personal names, at least 2,000 years ago, if not longer.
It is so fascinating.
Greenlight helps kids learn about money by actually using it. It's a debit card and money app that teaches kids to earn, save, and spend in real life, not just swipe and hope for the best. Learning happens naturally, in the moment. Parents can set limits, see real-time spending, and guide better habits all in one place, without constant check-ins or cash runs. Don't wait. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/trygreenlight.
An all-new season of The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives is now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
Mom Talk has just been blowing up.
Whitney and Jen are on Dancing with the Stars.
Taylor is a bachelorette.
Saying that out loud is crazy. Like, that is huge.
But all the cool opportunities could pull us apart.
It's causing issues in everyone's marriage.
My whole world is falling apart right now. It's chaos.
Watch the Hulu original series, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney Plus for bundle subscribers. Terms apply.
Is there a baby in your life who's about to start solid foods? This can be such a confusing and stressful time. As a mom of 7, I really struggled with spoon feeding my oldest baby. But once I realized that babies can safely feed themselves real, wholesome foods using the principles of baby-led weaning, feeding the rest of my babies became an actually enjoyable experience instead of something that I used to dread. Hi, I'm Katie Ferraro, college nutrition professor and dietitian specializing in baby-led weaning, and I host the Baby-Led Weaning Made Easy podcast. Each week, we cover evidence-based, safe infant feeding practices for parents and caregivers of babies who are 6 to 12 months of age. So, if you're confused by all the conflicting info you hear about starting solid foods, or you want easy, actionable tips on how to safely prep food for your baby, or introduce allergenic foods, or figure out when to drop a milk feed, we cover all that and more, plus interviews with the world's leading feeding experts in 2 new episodes each week. Search Baby-Led Weaning wherever you listen to podcasts, and happy feeding.
Okay, here's another question that calls back to our research, Jen, and I know you've been waiting for me to ask this question. When I was doing research for an episode on Scythian warrior women, which we covered years ago, I discovered and fell completely in love with the Akalteke horse, which, just a reminder for listeners, is an ancient breed of just gorgeous, jewel-toned horses from Turkmenistan. And please, if you're listening to this, just stop what you're doing and Google Akalteke, Akhalteke, horses. Google that. Look at the horses. Feast your eyes. I learned some things about the Akalteke horses in your book. One of them is that the Akalteke were one of 3 breeds of horses originally bred by the Teke clan. There were 3 clans, each of which bred their own very exceptional horses on the Akal Oasis to help them conduct slave raids. This is not a thing I knew. And the Akalteke were the most exceptional of these breeds. And the other thing I learned was that the Akalteke horse may have been descended from a breed called the blood-sweating horses of Fergana. Tell me about the blood-sweating horses.
Okay, so keep in mind that all horses are descended from the early domesticated horse of about 4,000 years ago. And so horses are fairly closely related to begin with. There's a lot of arguments about who's descended from whom. Many of those arguments have been cleared up because we now have genomic maps that show, for example, how much of the Akalteke horse is descended from an Arab horse, how much of it, etc. Okay, so going back to the 1st century AD, remember we've been saying over and over again that the Mongols had these little shaggy ponies, and the point about the Akalteke horses is they are a perfect example for being beautiful, imposing. They are a luxury. They are a Maserati kind of horse. The Akaltekes put a huge amount of work into breeding them, raising them, protecting them, feeding them in a very, very difficult environment because they needed to be able to run out of the desert into the agricultural lands of Iran, kidnap people, and then put them on the back of the horse and run back. So that's a very specific use case, so to speak, which requires a very powerful horse that can go very far distance on very little water. Now, nothing like that exists in Mongolia. When the Chinese were trying to fight off the Huns, the Xiongnu, and were looking for ways to strengthen their cavalry, they heard about the existence of very powerful horses, very tall horses, living on the western side of the steppe from the Xiongnu. So the Xiongnu are right up against the Chinese border, but if you go 2,000, 3,000 miles to the west, you get to an area of Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, which have very good pastures, a big agricultural surplus, which can be used to feed horses in the winter, and you can raise these horses inside if you need, and you can grow, and you can help them attain a much greater height than what you can in Mongolia. So the Chinese found out about this, and they decided to go bring some of these horses back to China, which is a long story, a very colorful story, a beautiful story, first told in English in a memorable way by Arthur Waley, the great translator from Chinese. And these horses were said to sweat blood when they ran. And there is a whole literature about what could that possibly have been. So one theory, and these are all theories, and this is one of those things where I don't think anyone has made any breakthroughs in the last 100 years. So we can stay on this podcast for the rest of the night discussing which of these are right. But one theory, which has some sense to it, is that this was a breed of horses where the skin coloring was so transparent that you could see their veins. If you think about the Akaltekes, you really do see their veins because their coat colors are kind of transparent at the same time, right? So it's possible that horses like this were raised in earlier times, and these may have been similar to the horses that the Chinese brought back. To say literally they're descended from the Akaltekes are descended from the blood sweating horses is I think, a poetic concision. Right? They come from approximately the same part of the world. They may have had the same use case. In other words, they were war horses. They were used for raids. They had to be very tall and imposing for prestige reasons, among others. So I think it's a beautiful image to think that these were the horses that the Chinese emperor got. And the other kind of continuity, which I find really powerful and magical, is that the Chinese emperor continued to get horses from the far west, from Afghanistan. As late as the 1750s, the Afghans were sending horses to the Chinese emperor, and he would say, the blood-sweating horses have come again. So from the Chinese mind, there was a complete continuity between 1st century BC and 18th century AD. And just finalize this, every year, the president of Turkmenistan gives several of these horses to the president of China. So the Chinese are still getting these horses 2,000 years later. And this is just for fun. There's two funny stories. One is that the Soviets gave one of these horses to Queen Elizabeth II. The Soviets gave an Akalteke horse, or let's say they offered an Akalteke horse to Great Britain, and the young person in the British embassy in the Soviet Union who was responsible for getting into the UK had a lot of problems. That could be its own book. And then the Soviet Union also gave a horse to President Mitterrand of France in the 1980s, and he secretly gave it to his secret daughter, who no one knew about, who no one was supposed to know about. He had an illegitimate daughter. And that was a major faux pas, because a gift to the head of state doesn't belong to an individual. It belongs to the state. And so the person who was head of the national stud in France spent a long time tracking down the horse and trying to find it. And then the last thing about the Akalteke is I met one of the recent American ambassadors to Turkmenistan, and they wanted to give the USA an Akalteke horse, and her job was to turn it down politely, because the logistics and the cost of getting a horse like that from Turkmenistan to the United States are just way above the budget of the State Department. And this is several years ago, by the way. So you can see that the gift of this horse to various heads of state, each one of these incidents generated some amazing Romanesque kind of story.
Okay, I am thinking about the story from 2,000 years ago that you tell in your book about the Chinese wanting the blood-sweating horses and what they had to go through, the war that they fought and the desert that they crossed and the killing fields to get these horses. And now Turkmenistan gives horses like this to the Chinese government as a gift, and has been for centuries. And they offer an Akalteke horse, which potentially, maybe not, might have been descended from these blood-sweating horses, to the West, and the West continually bungles it.
Exactly, because the Chinese are very respectful of history and tradition.
And the gift of this horse.
Right, and so they absolutely get it, whereas the British and the French and the Americans have no tradition of state-to-state horse gifts. That's just seems like a nuisance to us.
It is appalling. I am appalled and embarrassed.
I'm going to speak up on behalf of the horse here, because I'm thinking back to that story of how we've only recently understood that there was something in the hay that wasn't able to support the horses in different areas. It's possible that removing the horse from this area would be quite expensive and tricky, and there is no guarantee that the horse would survive.
Well, to be fair, this is modern times, though.
Sure, but I don't know when they gave it to Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth ruled for a very long time. In 2025.
I mean, we would have had selenium by then.
Sure, but they wouldn't have known that was the problem. If you gave it to her just after World War II.
Actually, they got it. I mean, in the case of the British, they did get it to her, and it did survive. It may not have been very happy in England, because, the temperature in England, it's not the same. But that's sort of the problem with zoos, right? We raise animals in environments very different from what they're used to. So, if you're really big on animal rights, yes, you would not want to take a horse from Turkmenistan and send it to France or to the UK. I agree with you.
Yeah, or particularly America, where it's not just sending it like across Europe, it's across Europe and then across to America, or I guess you go through Asia. It's a big change. I don't know, unless you're going to really be mindful of it. And that is part of the cost, right? Being mindful, giving it an environment that's similar to the one it came from. That's really tricky. Like I'm not the biggest fan of zoos or aquariums. Like I'm glad they exist in some ways because some creatures wouldn't probably make it without that, but it is difficult and it's not the best life for them.
Yes, that is a really good point, Jen. Yeah, all of this is very complicated, but I'm still embarrassed by the West and just the lack of respect.
Well, what they should have done is say, right, we don't think it's going to survive in our environment, but could we make a sanctuary here? Like, could we give you money to make a place for these beautiful horses? Could we sponsor them? It's almost like I've thought about trying to get a donkey home from Greece before and been like, no, that's not going to work in London. So
let's briefly talk about dressage. I used to be into 3-day eventing as a kid, so that is an event where you ride 3 types of discipline. You do stadium jumping, cross-country jumping, and dressage. I was always quite bad at dressage, and my little Arab quarter-horse pony loved to jump, just loved to run away with me at a gallop and then dump me into streams. That was his favorite thing. So he did love the cross-country portion of the event, but he was not a fan of dressage.
He didn't like horse dancing. That's what dressage is. It's horse dancing.
Not at the level I did it at, but yes.
Yeah, at the highest levels, it's horse dancing.
Anyway, you mentioned dressage as a discipline with extremely ancient roots. Let's talk about those roots. What is so ancient about dressage?
I believe dressage emerged from military training for hand-to-hand combat. So if we go back to our shaggy ponies, where you have a bow and an arrow and you're attacking the enemy from a distance, you don't need dressage. You need to ride up, shoot, and then get the hell out. From a fairly early time, the Iranian cavalry fought with lances and then with swords. There was a kind of a sword, maybe you talked about it in the Scythian episodes, which is kind of a short stabbing sword, which is a really bad idea to fight with on horseback because you stab your enemy and then either you let go of the sword because it doesn't come out or you get pulled off your horse. The other thing the Iranians fought with, by the way, with lassos, which is kind of interesting.
The Huns. We talk about the Huns and their lassos in our episodes.
Oh, okay. There you go. So the point is that in order to fight hand-to-hand, horses have to stand on their hind legs and kick with their forelegs. They have to be able to turn very, very sharply to get you out of the way of a sword or a lance. I'm trying to think of what other kind of typical dressage moves that correspond to fighting with a sword or a lance on horseback. But generally, I did play polo, by the way, and polo has a lot of things in common with hand-to-hand. It is a hand-to-hand combat sport, actually, because you have to run, you have to gallop towards a ball. You have to maneuver yourself to push the other person out of the way so that you can get between the ball and the other riders. And then the horse has to be completely still vertically when you're leaning over to swing your mallet. So that also, in addition to dressage, is clearly a military drill. And this is the origin of everything that we call high equestrianism. I think the Iranians invented it. It was transmitted to the Roman. The Roman cavalry manuals were then read by experts in Western Europe for centuries, and in the 17th and 18th century, it codified into what we do today.
I think about the part of dressage where you have to halt in the middle of the arena, and the halt is important. You would think that it is not, but it is very important that the horse halts with all 4 feet square, and that is a trained skill. So thinking about the horse needing to be still at certain points in battle, like maybe that originates from that, number 1. And number 2, if you really want to see, just for listeners, a clarified example of a horse dance, as Jen might call it, that really recalls battle in a very specific way, you could look at videos of the Lipizzaner stallions. which have this very, very elevated form of, I don't know if you'd even call it dressage, but a horse dance, basically, with a lot of leaping and kicking and moving in very close formation drills, which is not easy for horses. All kinds of really cool things. If you look at videos of them, it's absolutely incredible. Have you encountered the Lipizaners? I don't know if I got to that point in the book.
I didn't write about the Lipizaners. Maybe I mentioned them once. I have seen them many years ago.
Me too. I got to see them live a couple times, and I got to go and see them rehearse. It was incredible.
It is incredible. It's really frozen in time from 17th century Spanish writing. And if you look at the old horse manuals, recently I visited the horse museum in the Hermes headquarters, Hermes being the French luxury brand. Remember, Hermes originally made principally things for horses. And so they have a wonderful collection of antique books on horses. And you look at them, and the horses are leaping, the horses are doing caracole, the horses are kicking with their hind legs, stationary with the front legs. And all of those positions are positions which the Viennese school does now, which they inherited from the Spanish. So you think about the military application of that. You mentioned standing still. One of the most important things cavalry has to do is not move, because horses get excited by battle and young men get excited by battle. And pretty soon everyone is chasing after the enemy. And it turns out that the enemy has dug a trench full of stakes and they're hoping you charge into it. Or the enemy has simulated a retreat, but actually there's a much larger force of enemy hiding where you can't see them. So many battles, important battles in history, were lost. Horses and riders getting too excited. So the ability to take a horse through all those paces and his adrenaline is way up there, as is yours, and just stop and not move is an essential part of military discipline. And that's why it's a very important part of the dressage. And the other moves obviously are very helpful for combat, as we said.
Absolutely. And you can really see this written into a dressage performance. Like if you watch them at a high level, it's not just the moves, it's the power. You get a sense of restrained power, which is what you would want on the battlefield, right?
Yeah. Yes. The actual shock is probably very, very short. Remember, you ride, you don't gallop and charge. You ride in formation, and you mentioned problems about horses staying in formation and remembering in the European battlefield they're all stallions. They have to ride in formation, they have to keep formation, they're getting shot, they're dropping out, they have to keep tight formation, and they only gallop for the last 10, 20 yards.
Interesting to note, a lot of high-level dressage horses are stallions.
Yeah. Well, I think they just want to make it harder for you. I mean, because it's a tradition, because it's the tradition of European cavalry.
It's so fascinating and so interesting to learn about the history of things I had been doing since I was a kid, that felt like very natural to me and very specific to a time.
It's just been fascinating. I love learning all these new things. Like I always feel like the world of horses is something that I've always tangentially been absolutely fascinated with, but haven't had quite the up close experience that you've had, Jenny. It always sparks ideas in my mind, like particularly like when we were talking about small children kind of being the first to be able to like domesticate those wild horses and ride them for distances because they were lighter, and then eventually over generations, like you could have larger people riding on them, like how it equaled the playing field in herding and even movement of people. It's just fascinating and stuff I don't think about normally, and just reminds us how important the horse and, my heart goes out to the donkey and other animals like that were in and still are in the formation of human society and civilization, such as it is.
Thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been just a fascinating conversation. Do you have anything you would like to plug? Any new books coming out? Where can people find you on social?
Oh, well, I mean, Raiders, Rulers, and Traders has a pretty nice website where I've added some new essays that I've written since writing the book. You can find some videos and the podcast and so forth on that website as well. I am working on a book, probably not for a few years, that will talk about how the horse culture influenced the definition of what we call Europe versus Asia, and this intermediate area, which is Eastern Europe and how perhaps Eastern Europe is really more horse country than we think it is.
What's your website?
Well, you can Google raiders, rulers, and traders, and you may get some ads for the hockey team or the football team, the Raiders. But if you do raiders, rulers, and traders, you'll get to my website.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been absolutely incredible. And thank you all so much for listening. And we will see you whenever we see you next.
Very good. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Jen. Bye-bye.
Every act of change begins with a neighbor. When neighbors connect through the Feeding America network, small actions ripple into lasting impact. Feeding America, led by neighbors. Give now to end hunger at feedingamerica.org.